Howdy guys, I guess I should sit down first. Howdy guys, Ponchato here, and today we are gonna put together a new PC build. I figured with the new Ryzen 3000 processors out and RX 5700 GPUs, what better time to put together a new PC. Now I wanted to put together a small PC, but not like insanely small. I don't wanna get too crazy here, so it is gonna be an ITX build, but it's gonna be in a relatively large ITX case. We'll go through the full build and check out how it performs in a couple games later in the video, but first, let's get all of this stuff out of these boxes. Nice transition. So the heart of this build is gonna be a Ryzen 5 3600, which is part of AMD's latest series of 7nm parts, which basically just means they have a lot higher IPC and a lot more power efficiency than the previous series. The 3600 is a 3.6 GHz base clock with a 4.2 GHz boost. It has a 65 watt TDP and supports RAM speeds up to 3200 MHz, compared to the Ryzen 2000 series, which only supported up to 2933, so a little bit faster memory. The GPU is a Radeon RX 5700, which is also AMD's latest graphics card. The only models available right now have the reference blower cooler, which that part kind of sucks, but it is a very high performance graphics card. It has 8 GB of GDDR6 VRAM, and it takes a 6-pin and 8-pin PCIe, so that's quite a bit of power. Oh, and I guess kind of an important point, it uses PCI Express 4, which is also supported on the Ryzen 3000 series. That's also a new feature, and AMD was first. The motherboard I'll be using is a Gigabyte X570i Aorus Pro Wi-Fi, which as you can see is a mini ITX board. Has one PCI, well, I mean, every mini ITX board has one PCI Express by 16 slot, but this one has two M.2 slots. There's one underneath the chipset fan right here, and then one on the back of the board too. That's pretty cool. It also has built-in Wi-Fi, which connects on the back panel, and it has a USB 3.2 Gen 2, I think. The 10 gigabit per second one, Type-C port, also on the back panel. And a really pretty backplate. Fancy. The CPU cooler is an NZXT Kraken M22, 120mm liquid AIO. It has an infinite mirror top plate on the CPU water block, and comes with NZXT's 120mm radiator fan. Oh, and RGB lighting on the CPU block as well. So this should work great in a small case like this one, and it will also work with all the RGB stuff going on too. Fancy. For the memory, we have a kit of Team Group's T-Force Vulcan Z 3200 MHz 16 GB. This is a very reasonably priced set of RAM, and one thing I really like is that the heat spreaders are just barely taller than the standard RAM height anyway, so this won't cause any problems with CPU cooler clearance. Not that it matters that much with an AIO, but if you were to be using an air cooler, that's kind of important. For the storage, we'll be going with a Crucial P1 1TB NVMe SSD. This has a 2 GB per second read speed and 1.7 GB per second write speed, which is insanely fast. And one thing I really like is because it's an M.2 drive, no extra cables to deal with, no extra cable management. You just plug it into the motherboard and that's it. I really like that a lot. Now for the power supply, we have an FSP Hydro G 750 watt. Yeah, got that right. It's 80 plus gold, fully modular, has ribbon cables, and it has a fanless mode, which basically means under low load, I think under about 25%, the fan will completely stop, which I really like that feature in power supplies and helps a lot with keeping systems quiet. Now the case I'll be using is an NZXT H200i, which is a mini ITX case with a tempered glass panel on the side. Very smart cable management system, and I think they call it a smart control box, which can control all of the fan speeds and automatically adjust everything to balance between cooling performance and noise. It also includes an RGB strip up at the top, which is not on right now, but we'll see that later, and two 120mm fans in the exhaust and on the top, but I'll be taking one of those out to be installing the CPU cooler instead. And the final thing that NZXT sent me is an internal USB 2 splitter. Now the reason this is important is because most mini ITX motherboards only have one USB 2 connector. In fact, I'm pretty sure all of them only have one. Now, normally that's not an issue, but the M22 does use a USB connector to control the RGB effects here, and the case has that smart controller, which also uses a USB connection to the motherboard. So with the splitter, that's no longer an issue. Now, why did I go mini ITX if it's still a tower case? The reason I wanted to do that is because I wanted something as small as reasonably possible without getting into all the issues and extra steps and extra difficulty of putting together a true mini ITX system. Cable management in this is going to be way easier than it is in like those 5-liter cases. And this also supports full-size CPU coolers, it supports full-size graphics cards and ATX power supplies. Not something you can get with most mini ITX cases. And beyond that, I'm swapping components all the time, and a lot of mini ITX cases make it pretty difficult to change out components. With this, it's just like on a normal case, you take off the side panel, you swap out your cooler or your graphics card or whatever you're switching. Okay, now as usual, the build is gonna start outside the case on the motherboard. So first thing we'll do is pop the CPU in, lift up the retention bracket, drop the processor in place, and these are keyed. They'll only go in one way. You should not have to you can just drop it in. If you have to push it, it's facing the wrong direction. And it will not work if you manage to jam it in there. You're welcome to try though. So what I'll do now is put on the M.2 SSD, which involves removing, I guess I should note this really quick. On X570 boards, the chipset, except for I think one model, only one model doesn't have a fan. All the rest of them have fans here to cool the chipset. The main M.2 slot is underneath this heatsink, and it's just held on with 2 screws. So I will undo those, and then we'll be able to get underneath and put in the M.2 SSD. Hello. The one downside with these chipset fans on a mini ITX board is that it takes up one of the system fan slots. So you only end up with one system fan slot and then the CPU fan slot. But with the H200i case, that shouldn't be too big of a deal because I think it has 3 fan outputs and comes with a splitter, so you can control like 5 or 6 fans with it. Anyway, to put in the SSD, first let's remove the screw that's already installed there. These are really tiny, so they're easy to drop. Line up the SSD with the slot and then hold it down with the screw very carefully. Not like that. All right, I can do this. Let's try it one more. All right, let's try it 2 more times. Please go in. There we go, got it. Okay, boom. SSD installed, very nice. Now I'll put the chipset heatsink and fan back in place, screw it back in. I could have just used the M.2 slot on the back of the motherboard, but I figured I would use the harder to access one first, and then later on, if I decide to add another SSD, it'll be a lot easier. There we go. Now the next thing I'm gonna do is remove the stock backplate because the Kraken M22 uses its own special NZXT backplate, mostly because it has a universal backplate. It's compatible with like LGA 1151 and 2011 too. So with the top clips removed, the backplate should just be left behind. Here's all the hardware for the M22, backplate, cold plate, mounting bracket for AMD systems, USB connection, and then all the other stuff. Let's see, what will I do first? I am going to put the backplate on first. So the backplate has all the different mounting slots here, and these upright screws that will go up through the motherboard to the top, stick in like that, and then get screwed in from the other side to make sure that they stay in place. Kind of like that. And I'll do that with the other 3. Now with the backplate ready, we can put it through the motherboard. Hey, cool, I actually got the right mounting hole. So with that in place, next 4 plastic spacers. Cool. Next, we're gonna take the cold plate and stick it on the CPU. It does come with thermal paste pre-applied, so I'm gonna have to be kind of careful not to get that everywhere. And it does have the Intel bracket on by default. So we're gonna have to pop that off, which involves just kind of sliding it off the front very carefully, again, because I don't want to drop this. There we go. And then we'll stick the AMD bracket on in its place. Easy enough. Okay, so it does need to be installed like this because the NZXT logo, oh yeah, I can see it, needs to be upright. So let me pick the right mounting holes, which I believe those are the right ones. And we'll line it up and put it down. Okay, so with it on the CPU, I have 4 little plastic washers. These actually might be metal. But anyway, 4 washers that go on the standoffs before we put on these thumb screws with springs. And I'll just get these started and then I'll probably finish them with the this tool, screwdriver. And I'm alternating tightening them down, which is what you always do with every CPU cooler, no matter what, so that it doesn't get unbalanced and then start bending the motherboard or bending the cooler or breaking your processor. Now you'd have to really crank down on it to snap a CPU. Cool, now the CPU cooler is installed. That looks pretty good to me. Next thing we'll do is install the Team Group T-Force Vulcan Z memory. With the sticker facing towards the CPU, snap it in. So the motherboard is pretty much assembled and now we can start putting it into the case. Actually, real quick, one last thing on the outside. I'm gonna go ahead and install the fan on the radiator right now because it's gonna be exhausting out, so the radiator is gonna get attached to the case and then the fan will be on the inside of the case pushing out. Using the included screws with the M22 should be a fairly painless process. Oh crap. Okay, not necessary to get them that tight. Yeah, they have little rubber spacers in there. Don't need to be Gorilla tight. Yep, there we go. So the radiator is assembled. Now, one thing I almost forgot to mention, and this is really important, is to do a test boot outside of the case first to make sure everything is actually working. This is probably actually the most important step in any PC build because it is incredibly disheartening to put together a computer, turn it on, and then realize something is wrong and you have to take it all apart again anyway, and all of your work is for nothing. It sucks, and I'm gonna avoid that, and I'm going to advise you to avoid that too. We have the motherboard mostly constructed right here. I'll go ahead and put the, should actually probably set the motherboard on a box first. That way the GPU thing doesn't get stuck on anything or stab the table. And I think we found our first issue. Good thing we tested this. Now, if you can see right here, the little end of the brackets on the GPU run into this plastic cover right here before it can actually line up with the slot. Is it bent? It doesn't look very bent, but what we're gonna do here is bend it. I only need a little bit. I feel like I should advise you not to do stuff like this, but I mean, this part of the GPU is just a chunk of metal, so as long as you don't actually break anything, it should be okay. We'll line them both up. Now we'll see if that works. Oh yeah, okay. There we go. Okay, we're good. Now I'm gonna plug in the pump, and I should probably also plug in the CPU fan. It's not gonna be that big of a deal because we're just gonna turn it on and see if it works, but better to play it safe. Okay, cool. So that's all plugged in, and now we'll plug in all the power supply cables. I actually might end up installing the CPU power cable before I put the motherboard in the case. That may save a lot of hassle. I'll see how much room is in there. Because the thing with PC building is there's no one right way to do everything. Each situation, each motherboard, each case will have its own little quirks, which may, for example, make more sense to install the CPU power cable before you put it in the case. So whenever you're watching videos like this, don't think, oh, I have to do everything he says exactly as he says it. Just kind of, use your noggin and think about what will make things the easiest and what will go together the best and in what order. I'm just saying there's no right way to build a computer. You could build one in a cardboard box if you wanted to. I've actually never had to use a second PCIe power connector for a graphics card. All right, got the CPU cooler plugged in. Graphics card is plugged in, the motherboard is plugged in, everything looks snapped. So I think we're good there. Now I will plug in the power supply and the graphics card. Hopefully that's the right spot. Now that's all plugged in. Monitor is powered on. Turn on power. And here, let me redirect your attention to the screen. There we go. Okay, I believe this should be the power button right here. Okay, that's not it. Hey, yeah, it is. Whoa, Okay. Hey, okay, it turned on. The fans are spinning, that's good. LEDs are on, also good. And now we wait and let it think about what it's gonna do next. Sweet, so the gods of computing have smiled on us and it actually worked. Now what I'm gonna do is go through the BIOS and make sure that both memory modules are recognized, that the SSD is recognized, and that it all, you know, looks good on the inside. We'll see what happens from there. And by we'll see what happens from there, I mean, we'll move on to the next step of the build process. Also, one other thing I wanted to point out really quick. When you saw me sticking the screwdriver into the motherboard to turn the computer on, all I was doing was making a connection between the two power pins on the front panel connectors. All it is, the power button on a case is just a momentary switch. All it does is connect those two pins together, shorts them. Screwdriver does the same thing. Connect those two pins together and the computer gets the turn on signal. Make sure you're shorting the right pins though, because some of those, the LED ones might get messed up if you short them. In fact, they probably will. So make sure you're poking the right ones. It does see both memory slots. Well, it recognizes it as PCI Express 4.0 by 16, so good sign. And it recognizes the M.2 SSD. Yes, okay, cool. It is actually seeing everything that's plugged in and it appears to be working. Awesome stuff. And next, we're gonna get all of this stuff into that case. If you can, yeah, you can see that, okay. Okay, so I have both side panels off of the case, and next we are going to put the motherboard in the case. But before I do that, I'm gonna do a couple things to prepare to make my life much easier later on. First thing I'm gonna do is this is the CPU power cable. And what I'm gonna do is route it through the hole right here. I'm just gonna pull it through till just the end of it is on the back side of the motherboard tray. And that way, I'll be able to plug this in on the motherboard before tying everything down. What I'm trying to do is anything that needs to be accessed on the top or on the back, because there's not a whole lot of clearance in those two areas, I'm gonna try to plug them in before I put the motherboard into the case. And I also need to get the back plate. How did I forget that? Did this thing not have that? Oh, I actually don't need a motherboard backplate because this one has one built in. That's kind of cool. I'm gonna plug in the radiator cable as well, because that's also in the top left of the motherboard. And that's gonna be really hard to get to once it's already in the case. I'm going to test fit it in here and see where I want to put, wow, that is really tight. Where I want to put the radiator and how I want, honestly, I actually might just put this on the front. So let's get the motherboard in there. Now before this goes in all the way, we'll plug in the CPU power cable, since that's going to be otherwise a nightmare to get to. Let's see, like that. That probably just saved me like 5 minutes of trying to weasel my way around cabling. Gently put it down. I'll just set that right there. There we go. And then we'll screw it in. Cool, so the motherboard is installed, and next we'll attach the radiator to the front of the case. Now to install the radiator, I've already popped off the front panel that just pulls with the little handle at the bottom, and the removable mesh filter is at the front. That has 4 tabs that you just pull off. And then you have the fan, the front fan and radiator mounting bracket. This can actually be removed, which I can show really quick, which I imagine will be, if you were using like a 240 millimeter radiator, that would probably save you a lot of time, since you can take it out of the case and mount the radiator without having to try and squirm your way through a mini ITX case. Smart thinking, by the way, to NZXT on that. I really like that. Removable fan bracket. Really good idea. I'm gonna mount it as high as possible because I want the GPU to be bringing in as much fresh air as it can rather than air that's already been heated up with the CPU. And using the included screws and washers, we will go ahead and mount this at the front of the case. There we go. Now the radiator is installed. Pretty cool. Cool stuff. Next thing I'm gonna do is install the power supply. And the reason I'm doing this now is to figure out how much space I have to manage the cables underneath the power supply shroud before we plug in any of the front panel headers. I'm thinking this will be the easiest way to do this stuff. So what we'll do first is remove the SFX power supply bracket that comes included with the case. So you can use SFX power supplies with this case if yours didn't come with a bracket. I think most SFX power supplies will have a bracket, but NZXT includes one anyway, which is pretty nice. And apparently they have some pretty strong people in their factory because this screw is stuck in there really good. There we go. And there's the adapter bracket. Next, we can put in the power supply, but what I'm gonna do first is plug in all the modular cables, because it'll be a lot easier to do that with it outside the case rather than once it's already in there. So there's the CPU power, Molex and SATA power connector, and then finally GPU power. And now we'll put the power supply into the case. We got these screws started by hand. They're a little tight, so we'll just go straight to the screwdriver. Cool, that's installed. Looks good to me. The other thing is, while we're back here, I'm gonna go ahead and remove the graphics card slot covers. It has one of these little sliding doodads. There we go. Okay, so I just realized I did something stupid. Okay. I was thinking I was gonna use the radiator as an exhaust vent, but turns out I didn't want to put it on either one of these vents, so I put it at the front, and I already had the fan set up as an exhaust. Technically, I could just leave it here with it blowing out the front, but then the case will have very, very negative air pressure. Okay, here we go. So what I'm gonna do is put the fan in front of it. There we go. So air goes through there. Yeah, that'll work. Now what I'm gonna do is plug in some of the front panel headers. I'm gonna plug in USB 3, front panel IO, and then the HD audio. Here, is that in? Yep, that's in. Something I really like about this case is that they do things that make sense. Oh yeah, another thing really quick that I like about this case, this is the front panel, all of the front panel. It's the power switch, power LED, and I think the hard drive LED. Instead of having a bunch of loose wires, it's all packed into one. Because this has been pretty well standardized in the last couple of years. I haven't encountered a motherboard that has a different front panel setup. NZXT said, you know what, this is probably gonna work for any motherboard that someone's gonna use in our case, so let's do it. And I think they made the right choice. Next, the USB 3. Now, in starting to plug in stuff on the back panel, I ran into a minor issue with this specific setup. So the M22's CPU block has an RGB thing going on right on top of the CPU, and it's powered by a USB cable, USB plug. I think this is a mini USB, pretty sure it's a mini USB. But the issue in the H200 and H200i case is that the top fan is, the bottom of the top fan is right up against the top of the motherboard. So there isn't enough room for the USB cable. The fan runs into the USB thing. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna take out the top fan because we still have this exhaust fan plus the GPU is gonna be exhausting too. And with this vent here, there still should be plenty of case airflow. Okay, so I've moved a couple of the cables around so you can see what's going on here a little bit more easily. This is the extension cable, USB extension cable that came with the USB splitter, which I'll explain more about in a little bit. Here is the USB cable for the smart device, which is the fan and LED controller. And here is the USB cable for the M22's RGB stuff going on the CPU. Now, because there are two USB devices that need to be plugged in and only one USB plug on the motherboard, that's where the USB splitter comes in. White end gets plugged into the extension cable into the motherboard, and that splits it into 3 internal USB headers and 2 external USB ports. I can't think of what that would be used for inside a case, but I'm sure there's a reason for it. But anyway, the USB hub is powered by a regular Molex connector, and the smart device up here, fan controller, is powered by a SATA connector. Unfortunately, this power supply has one cable that has both Molex and SATA power, so I don't need to have 2 separate cables just to power this stuff. So I'm gonna plug all of this in, and then all we have left after that is the motherboard and then the graphics card to plug in the power. The other cool thing about the USB splitter is it's magnetic. So You can kind of stick it wherever you want inside the case and it'll stay. So we'll do the motherboard USB connection into the splitter, then the AIO, and finally the smart control box. Next, we'll plug in the power to the USB splitter, just the standard, whatever this is, 5mm DC jack, and then into the power supply here. Then we'll plug in the smart device into the power supply. What they say in the manual for the smart device is that you should plug in the CPU fan into the fan 1 slot. Now there was a fan splitter plugged in here before, but because I only have one case fan, I just removed that, and instead I will be putting in the CPU fan. Now everything back here is plugged in. Now don't worry, I'm gonna organize this a little better. I'm not just gonna try to jam everything back in there. I'm gonna plug in the motherboard cable later, since this one's kind of hard to work around. So what I'm gonna do now is manage the cables. I'm gonna leave the GPU for the last thing because we're gonna have to deal with a bunch of cables, and with the GPU in the way, that's gonna be kind of difficult. I'm probably just gonna go ahead and time lapse that because cable management is boring. And that is most of the cable management. Still got to plug in the graphics card, but that should be pretty simple. Nice work on the options back here, NZXT. Very nice stuff. Not bad. NZXT has this little doodad right here, which is a GPU support, which will be a good idea for a graphics card like this since it's huge. Plug that bad boy in and it just barely fits with the radiator in the front. So the GPU fan starts like right about there. So what we'll do, we'll set the support like right here. And now what that should do is relieve a lot of the strain on the motherboard PCIe slot. There, cool. I'll get these screwed back in. Now, because these are so far forward, what we'll actually be able to do is just not even go through any of the routing holes. Just use the holes at the front. 6-pin first. So that's all working and it looks pretty clean to me. Now that it's built, I'll go ahead and install Windows, and through the power of movie magic, I will skip to a fully functioning computer. We got to Windows, so I'd consider that a success. And look at how pretty this pupper is. So there's the complete build, and now let's see how it performs in games. By the way, leave a comment and let me know what games you guys want to see in builds and benchmarks. I pretty much just play Minecraft, not even kidding, so I'm out of the loop here. Anyway, gameplay. In Apex Legends, I get a pretty solid 140 FPS that stays consistent and very little in the way of lag spikes. Keep in mind, your performance will be slightly better because I recorded all this gameplay directly on this PC. Without recording software running, of course, things run a little bit faster. Next, in CSGO, a minimum of about 220 FPS depending on what's happening on screen. Again, smooth and consistent with very few missed frames. Another note, all these were recorded at 1080p and at max settings, so this is kind of a worst case scenario. If you lower the settings, you're gonna have a lot better performance. Now here's some Fortnite gameplay, pretty solid 120 FPS or so, and essentially no stuttering. So if you'll be playing Fortnite, this PC will have you more than covered. And this is with the settings turned all the way up, so if you turn them down, you can actually get quite a bit more performance out of it. Next on the list is GTA 5, also maxed out. On foot, it keeps about a 60 frame per second minimum, while driving around it does dip into the 40s, but this is with the advanced graphics settings all maxed out. So if you back off a bit on the extended render distance and extended shadows, you'll see quite a bit better performance. You'll be able to hit a constant 60 FPS very easily. Now let's look at some Just Cause 4 gameplay with settings on max. Even in complicated scenes with tons of explosions and stuff going on, in the worst case, it only dips into the 80s with essentially no stuttering at any point. Really well optimized game, actually. And now we'll swing to the opposite side of optimization and look at PUBG. To be fair though, they have made massive strides in this game's performance. Worst case FPS is in the 70s, hitting close to 130 inside buildings. And stuttering is minimal, probably owing mostly to the texture loading, at least that would be my guess. Overall though, not bad at all. Now another competitive shooter, Rainbow Six Siege. In this, I'm getting 130 to 170 FPS with the settings maxed out. And this is also a very well optimized game, and dropped frames are really uncommon on this PC build. So if you're gonna be going for competitive shooters, this is a build to look at. And finally, we'll take a look at The Witcher 3. This is a really good looking game and also performs great. Actually surprisingly good looking for being from like 2015. Just riding around, I'm getting a nearly constant 85 to 90 frames per second, even with the settings all the way up. That's some pretty stuff. So for about $1,300, you get a pretty sick gaming PC, and for single PC streaming, this would actually be a really great choice. The NZXT Kraken cooler looks great and has more than enough cooling power for the 3600. The Team Group Vulcan Z memory runs at 3200 megahertz using the AMP settings with no issues whatsoever, and the FSP power supply seems to run pretty much silently the entire time. Oh yeah, and the Wi-Fi antenna that comes with the X570 motherboard has a magnetic base, which makes it really easy to position. And I get about 75 megabyte per second transfer speed, which is the fastest wireless connection I've actually ever used. Beyond all that, the H200i from NZXT is a fantastically designed case. There were so many points when I was putting it together where I thought, dang, that is really smart. A ton of screws are captive, so they won't fall out when you unscrew them. The cable routing holes are huge and well placed, and pretty much everything about this case screams user-friendly. And it has a ton of space to expand storage with SSDs or hard drives, and of course the LED strip, which you can control in conjunction with the Kraken using NZXT's CAM software. All in all, a very nice package deal. Normally builds come with some kind of stipulations, but this is actually pretty sweet. I'm actually probably going to use this as my main gaming PC from now on. And if you're thinking about putting together a new build yourself, follow the link in the description to pick up all these parts. Hit subscribe and click the bell icon to get notified of new videos as soon as they're up. If you like this video, hit the like button. If you want to see more, hit subscribe. Yeah, that's gonna be like down there. And I wanna hear from you. Would you go for the H200i in black or white, red, or blue? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. I hope I helped, and I'll see you in the next video. Way too hot in this studio. I need to have like a fan blowing directly on me, but that is awful for sound quality. I need to move to Canada or something. Every single time I turn on a computer for the first time and it actually boots, it's always such a huge relief. It really never gets old.